Hi, it's Taylor T. Carlson, and I'm back with another video for you. I just did reviews for most of the major retro consoles out there on the market, including the NES Classic Edition. And while that system included 30 games, of course there were a lot of old favorites that were omitted. So today I'm going to do a video of 10 games that were left off of the NES Classic Edition, but I think these are all worthy games that really deserved a place on there. I'm not including any games that require peripherals, since the system's not compatible with those. And I'm also not including any Tengen games, since the legality of those and whether or not they're actually sanctioned by Nintendo is certainly questionable. I hope you'll like what I've chosen here. I also want to stress that these are in no particular order. It's simply a list of 10 games that I think should have been included on the system, and it may not even be the last one of these videos I do, because I had to narrow this down to a pretty small list, and there were a lot of others that I might have to do a second video for. Let's go ahead and get started. At the top of this list, and one of the absolute most surprising omissions, is Contra. This, of course, the classic run-and-gun arcade port from Konami, with the NES game actually improving on its arcade counterpart. The game's notoriously difficult, but it's also a favorite of many a gamer. We did get the sequel Super C on the NES Classic, but the original is the more influential and superior game, and I don't know about you, but I think it definitely deserved a place on here. Secondly on the list, and this one's kind of a cheat because it's actually more than one game, and that's the 6-game Mega Man series for the NES. We got Mega Man 2 on the NES Classic, but there are actually 6 games. That means there's 5 others that weren't included on here. All of these are worthy run-and-gun platformers that rank as some of the best on the system. I've actually got my Mega Man shirt on right here, and I love playing these games. They've been reissued over the years in many different retro compilations and assorted compilations of the series released directly by Capcom, who created the series, and again, they remain personal favorites. Next up, another Capcom one, Mighty Final Fight. The Final Fight port that was on the Super Nintendo honestly was pretty terrible. It got rid of the 2-player mode, it omitted a level and a boss character, and there were a lot of other changes. It was just really disappointing. Mighty Final Fight is actually a loose reimagining of the original arcade game, but it's done in like a super deformed, chibi anime art style. It's still disappointingly only one player, but it actually plays, in my opinion, a lot better than the Super Nintendo port. It even adds in like new special moves, and there's also a system where you can level up and become more powerful. I mean, who would have thought that the NES take on this would actually be better than the SNES take? This came out fairly late in the life cycle of the NES, so it never really got the proper credit, though. Definitely worth revisiting it. I would love to have seen it on the NES Classic. Next up we have Zelda's Revenge, Star Tropics 2. I always found Star Tropics, the first game, which was included with the NES Classic, to be a pretty underrated top-down platformer action-adventure RPG-type game, sort of in the vein of Zelda, but a little more linear. That game did have a few constraints, namely the fact that the controls were a little blocky. You could only move around in squares on the map during the action scenes, but the sequel actually basically fixes every problem the original game had, while at the same time staying true to its spirit and giving gamers more of what they wanted. There's even a pretty fun plot with the game, which involves traveling through time and having to return to fight the evil Zelda. This game, again, is one that came out very late in the life cycle, so it just never really got the proper credit, and I would love to have seen it here on the NES Classic alongside the first game. Next of all, we have 1943. This is an arcade port. It's a sequel to 1942, which was another Capcom arcade game that also showed up in a port on the NES. This game, disappointingly, is only one player, but it actually adds in a sort of level-up stat system, which keeps things more interesting, and a single hit doesn't destroy your plane like in the previous game, 1942. There's a lot of upgrades, a pretty strong variety of the enemies you fight against, and in all ways, I found this to be an improvement over 1942. It's definitely one of the best, top-down scrolling shooters on the system, and I would love to have seen it on the NES Classic. Next of all, and this is one of the really surprising omissions, Tetris. Tetris, of course, probably the most famous puzzle game of all time. The NES version was never as popular as the Game Boy version because the Game Boy version came with the Game Boy. But this NES version I thought was very respectable. It disappointingly lacks a two-player mode. There was an unlicensed Tengen version which wasn't produced for very long, and so that's something of a collector's item. That version actually has a two-player mode that the official Nintendo port lacks, although I think the Nintendo port actually plays a little better despite that, and it is kind of surprising just not to see any version of Tetris on here. Again, might be a legal issue since you have Tetris on pretty much every system that comes out now. Either way, would love to have seen Tetris in some shape or form on the NES Classic. Nextly, we have Batman the video game. This is based on the Batman '89 movie that starred Michael Keaton and Jack Nicholson, and movie tie-ins are usually pretty horrible. Not this one. This was a great side-scrolling platformer with a lot of diverse enemies and weaponry that Batman can use. You can even jump back and forth between walls to scale buildings, and it's really hard and frustrating at times, but it's actually an above-average platformer, and it's way better than you would expect from a licensed movie tie-in game of all things. Again, the omission of this was probably due to the fact that there's a lot of licensing issues when it comes to Batman, but definitely a great platformer, well worth rediscovering. Next up on the list we have Cristalis. This is a game from SNK. It's a top-down game kind of in the vein of the original Legend of Zelda, but I would argue that this might actually even be a superior game. There's a really interesting plot that actually fuses medieval fantasy elements with more futuristic elements. You have to collect elemental swords and do battle against the forces of evil. Not really the most original plot of a game on the NES, but the gameplay and the variety of different weapons you can use definitely make this one very interesting. There was a Game Boy Color port of this back in the day as well, but it would have been nice to have seen this get reissued on the NES Classic. Again, there might be legal issues since this is an SNK thing, which is an outside company as well. Next up on the list, and one of the biggest and most startling omissions, is Castlevania 3 Dracula's Curse. We got the original Castlevania on the NES Classic, which certainly belongs there, but then we got Castlevania 2 Simon's Quest, which is a really questionable entry, a game that you basically can't finish without a walkthrough. Castlevania 3 went back to the more direct action-adventure style of the first game, but it also added in additional playable characters and alternate paths you can take to the end of the game. It's one of my favorite games, not only in the Castlevania series, but on the NES, period. And seeing it omitted from this is definitely a huge disappointment. And the last game that I'm going to include on this list, Ducktales. Again, this is a licensed Disney tie-in game, and tie-in games a lot of the times are horrible, but not this one. Capcom, they're showing up a lot on this list, created this game. It's kind of in the style of the Mega Man franchise, but Scrooge McDuck uses a pogo stick as his weapon. He can bounce around on it, and he can also use it to club boulders at enemies, so it creates a pretty interesting style of gameplay. It's true to the show that it's based on, has a lot of the characters from the show actually making appearances, which is nice, and it definitely does not feel like a cheap tie-in. There was also a sequel that was very good, but kind of overlooked because it came out late in the NES's lifestyle. And there was even a remastered version of this that showed up on more modern consoles a few years ago, so the game's legacy certainly lives on. Its lack of an inclusion here is almost certainly due to legal issues, of course. What game do you think should have been included on the NES Classic Edition that wasn't there? Comment down below and let me know. Like this video if you found it helpful and interesting, and also subscribe to my channel for more content. I'm Taylor T. Carlson, and I will be seeing you in my next video.